Today's guest is somebody I've actually fought with. Literally, not metaphorically. I have crossed lances in jousts with him. Dr. Tobias Capwell, I know him as Toby. He used to be a curator at Arms and Armour at the Wallace Collection and other places. He's also a jouster and he's a practitioner of late medieval armour. He shares my love of the material culture of the Middle Ages. Today he's here to natter with me about armour, horses, our jousting experience, and what jousting can tell us about life in the medieval period. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Hello everybody, welcome to another Future Imperfect. And I've got a very exciting podcast for you because I'm going to have a chat with somebody who I have actually crossed lances with at the Tower of London. So, Toby Capwell, Dr. Tobias Capwell, would you do us the favour of introducing yourself to our illustrious audience?
Hi, Jason. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm a specialist in medieval and Renaissance arms and armor, and I'm an academic researcher and specialist in that area, and I'm also a practitioner of medieval and Renaissance martial arts, horsemanship, and so forth. Like a lot of people who do this kind of thing, I suspect, I wanted to be a knight when I was a kid. I certainly wanted to be a knight a long time before I wanted to be a curator in a museum. So for me, like a lot of other people, this is a child's fascination that's gotten out of control.
That we never grow out of. We
Right.
keep the child alive in us and we
Right.
continue to delve into it.
Yeah.
So from an early age, you were interested in arms and armour, but what was your first experience of the real thing? And how did you realise you could transition from pretending to doing?
Oh, I never realized. I just always assumed that that's what I would do.
Okay.
I mean, one of my earliest memories is going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which has one of the greatest collections of European arms and armor in the world. And that was it, really. I was 5 years old looking up at these extraordinary mounted equestrian figures in this day-lit gallery, and I just wanted to be one of them, you know. And I just assumed that that's what I would do. I started riding at the age of 10 with this express goal in mind. It took me a few years to wear my mother down, I suppose, because riding is perceived as being dangerous, even though it's not really among the most dangerous things one can do, I suppose. Better than riding a motorbike, I guess. And then I just had the interest. And I pursued the interest however I could. I mean, like I started sport fencing as soon as I could. When I was about 11, there was a club nearby. And sport fencing has almost nothing to do with any historical martial art. But when you're a kid, you do what you can do. And a very codified form of abstracted sword fighting is better than no sword fighting. And, gradually I just followed the leads and kept riding and had my own armor made when I was about 19 is when I had my first armor.
Oh, wow. What kind of armour was it?
Oh, it was an approximation of a German Gothic armor of the late 15th century.
Right.
But I wouldn't say that it would pass muster these days. But at the time, this is like...
Well, you got to start somewhere.
This is 1990, right? So standards were different. The community was non-existent back then. And, it was a different world. And again, as a kid, you do what you can do. And then my way into professional academia was actually jousting, and having already had some jousting experience by that point, I joined the Royal Armouries when they moved up to Leeds in 1996. So I was riding horses and training horses for jousting and doing jousting as my first museum job, basically.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Well, I mean, I often get asked by people who are interested in working in museums, how do I become a curator? How did you become a curator? And I say, look, how I became a curator is probably of no use to you, whatever,
Learn to joust first.
You do what you can do. You follow the leads and the opportunities that you have. You hopefully get lucky, but you've also got to have the kind of dedication to make the most of the luck that presents itself, really. And that's what I tried to do. I was very lucky to be working in a national museum in the UK in my early 20s. And once I got my hands on real objects, I'd been studying a bit in museums before, but when I was working at the Royal Armories, I was with the real thing every day, and I could talk to curators and I could talk to conservators, and I really saw that this was the way forward.
Yeah.
I wanted to work academically again.
Because I think one of the things that I commonly come across is this idea that arms and armor are a costume
Yeah,
that is sort of primarily seen on film and TV and is something that, something other. I often point out to people, and you've probably got your own way of explaining this, but this was largely safety equipment. It provided a level of safety from potentially lethal sport. It's also got a component to fashion. I remember talking to you some time ago about, is it safety equipment? It's like, yes, but it's also other things as well, because it represents,
yeah,
well, it's a statement, isn't it? I mean,
yeah,
you're very aware of this. It's a
yeah,
physical statement about your wealth.
yeah. Well, there is the functional necessity, but throughout human history, things that we have done for pure basic functional necessity have naturally and kind of inescapably bound themselves to our identity and become artistic and cultural expressions as well. It happens naturally. There's no way of avoiding it. Let's imagine yourself as a Stone Age person, all right? 50,000 years ago. The weather is getting colder. It's a cold time of year, and you realize you got to go kill that bear who lives up in that cave
Yeah.
one way or another, or you are going to freeze to death. So you have a basic life saving necessity to one way or another get that bear pelt. So you think about it really hard and you develop your system and you come up with a plan and you make the best weapons you can make and you go up there and you kill that bear. And it's a long, hard fight and you're hurt, but you manage to prevail. You skin that bear and you make a coat out of it, right? But then when you walk back down to your village wearing the pelt of a bear that's killed scores of people over several years, well, how do people look at you? They're going to look at you differently.
Mm-hmm.
You did it because you're cold and you need a coat, but they look at you as a slayer of bears, as a person who is now more than an ordinary human, someone who has taken on the identity of its opponent or its enemy. And we can prove that people realized that functional processes like hunting immediately transformed into cultural expression because in these old burials, you already see people making jewelry out of bear teeth and claws and wolf teeth, demonstrating there's an awareness of the connection between these physical skills and these accomplishments and identity. And warriors have always done that. They associate themselves with wolves, bears, lions, crocodiles, the power of the natural world that in traditional circumstances has overpowered humanity. That's also a way of expressing the superhero or, the superhuman abilities of a warrior. So, yeah, armor is exactly the same thing. You build it because you can't go near a medieval battle and survive unless you have protective equipment of some kind. Hundreds of people with razor sharp weapons all over the place. You got to wear some kind of protection. But as soon as you do, what you put on your body tells people who you are in a very specific way. I mean, anybody can identify with this. We do the same thing now with clothes and cars and
Watches, handbags.
yeah,
Yeah.
we take the inanimate objects around us and we use it to express identity. So these are very ancient processes that we can all understand. They're still going on. And the arms and armor of the medieval knight is just, one of many examples of that.
And does the shape of armor then give us a clue as to the fashion of the soft clothing, the sort of fabrics of the day? Or is it intertwined? Is it the opposite of that? Is it fashion that follows the military? Or does that vary throughout history?
It's both.
Right.
And sometimes it's very hard to tell where function ends and expression begins. The armor of a late medieval knight is equipment for fighting, and it's a wearable work of art at the same time. And those two aspects exert pressure on each other and they influence each other. to the point when you can't tell where one begins and the other ends. Sometimes something is invented for a functional purpose, and then it starts a non-functional stylized fashion. Similarly, an armor designer sets to work designing something new. He's already working under his generation's idea of what looks good on the human body. Generation by generation, decade by decade, fashions evolve. And the root of fashion is, what is our ideal human body? And how do we design things that move us closer to that ideal form? And how do we accentuate certain things and downplay other things? So even if the armor isn't literally referring to clothing or vice versa, they are by definition connected because it's all part of that culture's attitude to clothing the body.
I mean, one of the things I think is interesting for modern people is the idea that the masculine silhouette was quite wasp-waisted
Yeah,
at the time in the later medieval, and it's sort of quite, you see it and you think that's quite an unusual shape. That seems almost quite impractical, but is that in what the armor that's typically called Gothic these days?
you're absolutely right to bring in the waist example at this point. It's one of the best examples of this function versus art question. Because you could say, on the one hand, yes, these tight waists, which appear in the 14th century, in the late 14th century, and then they continue the attitude to narrow waists. It continues for several hundred years after that in one way or another. You could say this is about vanity. You could say this is about trying to make yourself look thinner and more graceful than you actually are. When the so-called wasp waist appeared in the middle of the 14th century, there were people who railed against it, who said, this is vanitas, this is a sinful, self-regarding, you're distorting God's work by trying to make yourself look a different way than how you were made. There was a lot of opposition to it. The knight, Geoffrey de Charny, in the 14th century, one of the most famous of all French knights of the Hundred Years' War, the bearer of the Gonfalon, the holy French banner of war, who was killed at the Battle of Poitiers. He wrote a book of chivalry where he rants against these narrow waists. So clearly it's a fashion, clearly it's culturally resonant, but the fact is that wasp waist has to come in on armor because it's about weight efficiency. How can you design something where you can carry the weight as efficiently on your body as possible? If you're not carrying the weight efficiently, you are not going to be an effective fighting man. So you narrow that waist on that body armor. It's like doing up the belt on a rucksack. You do up the belt, it takes the weight off your shoulders. And interestingly, you don't really get the wasp waist in Europe until you are getting solid, hard body armor in the second half of the 14th century, where it's rigid enough so that that tight form is actually going to be meaningful. If it's an earlier body armor made out of lots of little metal plates, riveted to a leather covering or a textile covering, you do up the waist and they all just sort of fall down anyway. You don't have the structural integrity to really support in the way the waist is doing until you've got full plate armor. So, which came first?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I've dabbled in some of the early periods as well, and those coat of plates, the sort of Visby coat of plates,
Yeah.
create this sort of dump truck-like silhouette. You
Yes.
you end up being a barrel with legs,
Yeah.
and it's very, very different. And then you sort of move fast forward to the middle of the 15th century or the end of the 15th century, let alone going later into the Renaissance, and you've got totally different outline. And I think it's one of the problems sometimes reenactors struggle with because you have to be quite fit and have a not chunky physique to carry off some of these styles of armor, I would have thought.
Yeah. I mean, if you start really looking in any period, you will see examples of people whose body shape is less than the ideal of the time. And you will see, if you look, for example, at funerary monuments in Germany, you can find big guys wearing Gothic armor. And you might say that it's the armorer's job to make his client look good.
Right.
It's the armorer's job to make that client approach the ideal as best he can. But those fashions change because by the 1520s, 1530s, the male aesthetic was changing. They prized width over length. And, it's not totally an accident that Henry VIII starts to look bigger. He's not the only one. There's plenty of German noblemen of the 16th century are starting to look like velvet-covered refrigerators,
Yeah.
So the body is inextricable from the fashion.
I find it fascinating. How fashion attached were they? Or did they poo-poo it, as you said?
Well, beyond pure body type, I mean, again and again, we can see the personal preferences of the elite aristocracy leading fashion. It's like Henry V says at the end of Shakespeare's play, we are the makers of manners. We do what we want, and what we like then transfers into a new fashion. So, for example, in the middle of the 16th century, the King of Spain, Charles I, was also Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, one of the most powerful and influential people there ever lived in Europe. And he loved chivalric culture. He loved leading his armies personally into battle, even though he was as important as a head of state can possibly get. He still hazarded his body on the field and in tournaments. He jousted personally, and a lot of his armors survive at the Royal Armory in Madrid. But Charles V's favorite armorers, although he worked with a lot of different craftsmen, his favorite armorers were the Helmschmieds, the Helmschmied family in the city of Augsburg. And his connection with them goes back to his grandfather, the Emperor Maximilian I, who had been working with the Helmschmieds since the late 15th century. So there's a long tradition by this point of this Helmschmied family, some of the best armor makers that ever lived, both technologically and artistically. They'd been working for the Habsburg court and the Habsburg royal family for several generations. So then Charles V has a son, Prince Philip of Spain. He's going to succeed his father as the ruler of Spain. And while he's still a prince, and while he's being groomed by his father to take on all of these huge international responsibilities, he's also having armor made by the Helmschmieds, like father, like son. And Prince Philip is having portraits painted of him wearing his Helmschmied armor by Titian, who is also painting portraits of his father in Helmschmied armor. It's not just the armor, there's a whole artistic engine that goes behind, really creating and maintaining the public persona of these people. So then later on in the late 1550s, Charles V has a nervous breakdown and has to retire. And Philip is now a ruler in his own right. He's not King of Spain yet, but he's going to be King of Spain pretty soon. We're now in the 1557-ish. And once he is a ruler in his own right, what does Philip do? He fires the Helmschmieds, never works with them again. And he builds a new relationship with an armorer named Wolfgang Großschädel in the city of Landshut, which is also in Bavaria. It's only like 100 miles away from Augsburg, where the Helmschmieds were. It might not seem like a big change, really. The Landshut style and the Augsburg styles are very closely intertwined. It's sometimes hard to tell them apart.
Right.
And yet he has a new relationship with a new craftsman who has a distinct style. He fires Titian,
Right.
and he gets his own portrait painters as well. And so now the king of Spain has shifted his patronage from one place to another. When he does this, all the Spanish nobility had contracts with Augsburg armorers.
Wow.
But as soon as there's this shift in patronage, they all get rid of their Augsburg patronage and they all go to Landshut as well, or Elsra.
Oh, they just follow.
They just follow what the king's doing. And the Augsburg armor industry, which had been dominating Europe for generations, almost collapsed overnight. Almost everybody went out of business. There's only a couple of prominent Augsburg armorers, foremost Anton Pfaffenhauser, who were good enough businessmen to weather that storm and to get other patronage and survive. But that's an example how the tastes of one person, a leading individual, can lead a whole new fashion The Spanish court now, Landshut armor is what everybody's about. And if you look at portraits of the second half of the 16th century in Spain, that's what they're all wearing.
I find that fascinating because in history, often we have inferences and general principles, but there's an example of one man changing his mind for reasons we're not probably quite sure what,
Yep.
and it having a massive knock-on effect on an industry.
Yep.
And we can trace it.
Yeah.
Isn't that wonderful? I think it's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Even more than that, we can also see how those individuals were very consciously using their power to manipulate fashion and trends for their own political gain. So, for example, Henry VIII in England, following the lead of Maximilian in Germany, Henry VIII founded his court workshop at Greenwich in 1515 or thereabouts. And within a few years, those Greenwich armorers, who were mostly from Germany and Flanders, they had created a new style for Henry VIII, the Greenwich style, that was totally unique and distinctive, both technically and artistically. But this is a small royal workshop that's attached to the royal palace at Greenwich. And initially, they are only there to make armor for the king's own person.
Oh, right. Like personal. So personal armor.
It's personal gear. He wants armor for war. He wants armor for tournaments. It's like a 5-minute walk
Right.
from his personal apartments at Greenwich to the Royal Armory at Greenwich. And he's basically just there to make armor for him. But very quickly, he notices that he can give a Greenwich armor as a gift. And that will have tremendous significance because you can't buy these. It's not like people can just go to the Greenwich Royal Workshop and buy armor. They're not allowed. It doesn't happen. But the king, once everybody knows he's got this amazing style, he can give these armors as he likes. And suddenly, how singled out for glory are those individuals? There's only a small handful that have armors of the king's personal style. And it's like wearing the king's preference and approval. You are clearly one of the inner circle. You know the king personally.
Yeah. I mean, he was a savvy operator.
Oh, sure. But then once that starts to develop, can you imagine everybody in his court, every diplomat who visits his court is going to be hoping, gee, maybe I can get one of these things. And then his daughter, Elizabeth I, took it another level. She's not wearing armor because she's a woman, and women didn't really fight in armor that much. Occasionally there's an exception, but, Kate Blanchett gallivanting in Gothic armor, is a Hollywood image. It never happened in reality. So Elizabeth has this royal workshop, but she doesn't need it personally. But what does she do? She starts granting licenses to her courtiers to have their own armors made in her royal workshop. And they have to pay for the license. And then they have to pay a huge amount of money for the armor. And so Elizabeth is shoring up her whole system of political loyalty. She's made herself the goddess of chivalry at her court rather than the greatest knight, as Henry VIII was. She's defending everything that has to do with loyalty and legitimacy, keeping that structure, keeping her knights just rabid for her approval and her attention. And she's making a tremendous amount of money at the same time.
Yes. So she was savvy as well. So it sounds like that family was quite well switched on when it came to the sort of business of being royal as well as the functional side of it.
Well, you don't stay on the throne that long, almost continuously, pretty much continuously, for as long as they did without knowing what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to come back to your personal experiences of armor, though. So we've both jousted in similar historical plate armor. And I wanted you to describe your experiences of going down the list because they might be similar to mine. And we've crossed lances at the Tower of London, at Kenilworth Castle, both the moats there, and probably lots of other places as well, because it all tends to blur into one event sometimes.
Kenilworth always sticks in my head for some reason. That was about 10 years ago, I think.
I think so, something like that, yeah.
And then were you at the first Tower Joust? We did that one for like 3 or 4 years.
No, I think I just did one or two of them. I can't quite
Yeah,
remember.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, you had a reputation for being a very good jouster, and anybody went up against you was trying to beat you. So, were you aware of that reputation that you carried? And I guess every lance is just the next lance.
Yeah, I was somewhat aware of it. I'd also by that point advantaged myself by employing the resources I had academically by that point to do research into equipment and how it should work and how it should be designed, how it should fit, that would immediately advantage me on the field.
Right.
I've always tried to get my academic work and my activity as a practitioner to kind of work together. So, for a long time, in the early history of the jousting community in this country, I was able to kind of stay ahead of the game a little bit because my research was pushing me to the next level. And I had the advantage of doing my historical research as my day job.
Also, you're looking at primary sources as well, whereas a lot of people in reenactment literally don't know how to do primary research, or they're not quite sure where to get it from. And as a curator of arms and armor, as somebody whose job it is to do this research, it's kind of second nature to you to come across manuscripts or be able to read them or work out how to interpret them. Whereas other people are using secondhand. Sometimes they're very good sources, but they're necessarily secondhand what somebody like you has put in a book,
Mhm.
for example.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about research for me is that I always feel uncomfortable doing research unless I already know that I'm going to have methods of dissemination in place because I can't bear knowing things without some way of sharing them with people.
Okay.
And because your research is basically worth nothing if you're the only one who knows about it. And the value is immediately proportional to the number of people who know about it. So, I write books as fast as I can to, represent where my work is. And hopefully, people are then able to use my work to benefit their own practice. Whenever I'm writing even fairly academic stuff, I always have practitioners, armor users, armor wearers, HEMA, historical martial artists. I always have fellow practitioners in my mind. There's always a part of me that's writing for them because when you're out there doing it, the value of what you learn from your practice, from your physical practice, is related to its accuracy. If you're wearing an armor that doesn't work like a real one and doesn't fit you like a real one should, and is made out of polyurethane or whatever, you're obviously not having a historically valid experience. You've got to get as close to the real human experience as in the 15th century as you possibly can.
Yeah.
And when you've gotten close to it, then your physical experience starts to have a greater relevance, especially to people who aren't practitioners themselves. If you're describing what it feels like to people who are never going to do it, then there's a moral obligation to make sure what you're doing is as real and as authentic as possible.
Is there anything from your research that you found that surprised you, or that you realized other people before you who didn't share the same kind of practical aspects to the research had just got wrong, or that you had to correct? Is that something that's happened to you?
Well, like Aristotle said, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants. And, I couldn't be where I am now without the work that earlier jousters did in the 60s and 70s. And academically, we depend on all that generations of scholarship that points us in the right direction. Sure, when we get to an advanced level, we might realize half the books on my shelf are totally wrong. But I only was able to get to that point because of the boost they gave me. It's like a multi stage rocket ship. And, we all need those booster rockets to get us to our true starting point.
Mm.
And that's a really important part of it. And we're always trying to refine what we're doing. One of the things that really encouraged me, it's happened a number of times, just in respect to jousting and the pursuit to reconstruct an authentic joust in the modern world. I'm always asking myself, how close is what we're doing to what they were doing. How accurate are we really? Well, we got these new saddles. That's better. Okay, we're using these new lances. That's better. Well, my new armor is way more accurate than my last armor. Okay, fine. Always saying these physical activities can stagnate, when everybody just starts to get into the habit of doing what they did last year. This is the way we do it. Year after year, this is what we're going to do. It's easy for that to happen, but I always try to say, how can we do this better? How can we improve what we're doing? But how do you know? How do you know that what you are doing as a modern jouster bears any resemblance at all to what they were doing? And there's been a few things along the way in my career. Sometimes they seem like little inconsequential things, but they're really meaningful. Like, for example, when I was jousting at the Royal Armories in the late 90s, we were initially pretty rubbish and we didn't hit each other very much. And our lance technique wasn't great, and our riding skills weren't great, and our armor wasn't great, and our saddles were wrong, but we were working at it. And at the armories, we got a fair amount of practice, and we got progressively better. And we started hitting each other a lot more, to the point when we started getting honestly competitive. So how do you normally score a joust? Well, you got to tell where you struck your opponent, and somebody else has to notice where your opponent struck you, because it's a game of accuracy as well as a game of strength, right? So normally, this is historical as well as a modern thing. You have spotters. You have people on the ground whose only job it is to watch where the lances go. One guy at the end of the field is watching where Toby's lance hits Jason, and the other guy's watching where Jason's lance hits Toby. And they feed that information to the judge, and hopefully the judge makes the right decision. But we found out that it's very, very difficult for the spotters within the moment to be accurate, because sometimes a head hit can look like a chest hit. Sometimes it looks like it breaks on the chest when it's really on the shoulder. Sometimes it looks like it's on the arm when it hit the chest first and then moved over. And we were starting to find that what the spotters were saying didn't agree at all with what we thought we had done. And jousters don't always know where they've hit somebody, but a lot of the times they have a pretty good idea that there's no way on God's earth that could have been an arm hit, right?
Yeah.
So we decided, just for ourselves at the Royal Armories jousting team, we're going to put black boot polish on our lance heads.
Right.
Okay? We're going to smear black boot polish on all the lance heads. So when you hit somebody, you get a black smear on your armor. And that's easy to clean off, but it's also sticky and it's going to stay on for as long as you need it to. And then you can see, nobody called a chest hit. They all called them as shoulders and arms, but the breastplate's covered in black polish.
Right.
So there's obviously something wrong with the scoring, right? And we just thought we were doing this as modern people trying to get better at what we're doing. And then a few years later, I was working on the translation and interpretation of a 16th century jousting treatise by a 16th century Castilian knight. And he says, you should always smear red ochre on the lance heads, because otherwise nobody will know where you hit.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's an example where our practical activity is actually doing something historically authentic, not because we did our homework and we're doing what they did, but because we're in a similar situation and our needs, our functional needs in that situation are now the same as they were in the 16th century. And over the course of 30 years of jousting, I've encountered a lot of things like that, where later the historical sources that we only uncover at a much later point validate what we've been doing for the last 30 years.
Wonderful.
So that's encouraging.
Yeah, that is encouraging. What's the most surprising thing you've had happen in a joust? I mean, any remarkable moments that you can remember?
I mean, there have been some extraordinary moments, things you just could not make up. There's been some horrific things which could easily have led to a serious accident or catastrophe. Luckily, did not. There have been amazingly heroic, godlike moments where you can really see how chivalry worked and how knights doing this stuff that they did, armored fighting on horseback, how it could really create the image of them as divinely inspired or divinely empowered superheroes. I'll give you one example. This is one of the most famous jousting moments for those who were there and those who still tell the stories. I was there. I wasn't jousting. I was jousting in the event. It just wasn't my course at the time. But I was stood right at the end of the field, and I had a better view of this than just about anybody else. It was Dominic Sewell versus Steve Mallet. I think this is about 2002. We go back, look through the records, and we would be able to say for sure. But it's around that time. It's at the Royal Armouries, when the Royal Armouries is now not just jousting amongst itself, it's now inviting outside teams to come and compete against them. So it's Dominic Sewell versus Steve Mallet. Dominic, at that point, was jousting for the Destrier team, which you've also been involved with in the past.
Yep.
And Steve was jousting for my team at the time. And we were both external visitors by that point, or venans, as they would call them in the 15th century. And Steve and Dom were both great horsemen already and famous for hitting about as hard as anybody can. And that was a year when a lot of pretty hard hits started to happen. And Dominic was running towards me from the far end. And Steve, because I'm on my team's side, Steve on my team is running away from me down the tilt on my side. And they hit each other so hard. It was like, you can easily say as a storyteller that the ground cracked open under the force of the impact, and lightning spontaneously erupted from clouds in a bright blue sky. I mean, it was one of the hardest hits that anybody at that point had ever seen. And Steve flew right off the back of his horse.
Nice.
And Dom was completely out. He was completely out.
Right.
There's no way he should have been able to stay on the horse. And I saw it. This is burned into my memory. I know for a fact that the only part of him that was in contact with the horse and the saddle was the rear part of his left knee.
Right.
All right?
Yeah.
So imagine, as a horseman, imagine the position.
Yeah.
If the only part of you is the back of your left knee that's anywhere near the horse. There was that snapshot. And then the next snapshot of a microsecond later, Dom's back in the saddle, sitting on the horse fine, and riding up to me, and he makes some explanation like, oh, that was a hard one, or something terribly understated.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
And I'm looking at him awestruck, because there's no, it was like a bad edit. It was like somebody had edited out some frames of the movie when he went from completely out of the saddle, blip, to back on.
Right.
And there was like no movement, no history in there. And everybody who saw this agreed that that's what happened. And the only thing that we could explain was that between those two frames, Dom out and Dominic back in, between those two frames of the movie, a hand came out of the sky, came out of a cloud, a golden hand, and scooped Dom up and put him back on the horse.
Right.
And that's, for me, the greatest ever.
So how was Steve after that? Because I obviously know both of them. I've crossed lances with them many times. How was Steve? Was he flat on his back and swearing?
No, he was not swearing. He was just lying flat on his back, and he lay there for quite a long time. Steve has a history of staying on the ground after he's fallen in a joust.
Right.
Not because he's hurt, but just because it's more comfortable down there and he can have a rest. And he might as well.
More theatrical, because he's a good performer.
He just likes staying down there and having a rest and waiting till someone comes and scoops him up again.
And of course, everybody on the ground is really worried about him.
Yeah. It's a funny thing with double unhorsings. I mean, this was basically a double unhorsing that was unmade through divine intervention. But I've been involved in my career in a few double unhorsings where both jousters knock each other off. And the funny thing about them is that when you're one of the jousters involved in a double unhorsing, you don't know it's a double unhorsing. You only know that you're on the ground. And you think for all the world that it's a single unhorsing and that you have just been laid low. And there's often a wonderful moment where the two grounded jousters get up and turn around, and there's a moment when they realize that it was a double unhorsing to mutual celebration.
Right.
That's always a magical moment too, when you realize you've been a part of something much rarer and more miraculous than just a garden variety unhorsing.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end for now. I mean, we could continue to talk for a long time. We should maybe talk more about, some of the historical details in a future
Sure.
encounter. But it's been absolutely delightful to listen to you tell us these stories. If people want to follow you on social media, do you have a social media sort of presence?
Yep, I do. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. I'm not on formerly Twitter, X. There's a limit to what I can do and what I can keep in my head. But I'm on Instagram and Facebook, just Tobias Capwell. I'm reasonably easy to find. On Instagram, I just try to keep a running program of things that I'm doing and things that seem to me to be interesting. And I also use that to update people on lectures and symposia and other things that I'm doing and new publications whenever they come out. So, I mean, for anyone who doesn't know me or hasn't heard of me before, Instagram is a good place to start. You get a pretty good, rapid idea of who I am and what I do from there, I hope. Otherwise, I mean, there's YouTube. I don't have my own channel. I never have, but I've done a lot of things on a lot of other channels. I review video game design, films. I talk about weapons, jousting. There's increasingly more of my lectures online and then publications. If people rather have physical objects, I write books as fast as I can.
Wonderful. Are you still jousting?
I'm not. I actually have just decided to retire. It might be the first public announcement of that I've made, but I'm fairly sure I'm retired from the lists now, although I'm recovering from an injury, which has sort of made me rethink what I do. An injury that has nothing to do with jousting.
Right.
I fell playing with my kids and broke my neck.
Oh,
So I've been recovering from that and thinking about the future of such things. But I can go back to martial arts, both modern and historical martial arts and riding. But jousting, I think I've probably run my last course.
well, I haven't jousted for a long time, but one day I might get back into it. But I guess, sometimes it takes a lot of effort and you've got to find a crew to help you because it's a jousting night is a crew-served weapon, really.
But it's also not just an activity that one does on the weekend. It's a lifestyle choice. And you need to train and you need to have the relationship with your horses and your armor. And, there's got to be a lot of devotion and training behind it. And if you're not sure whether you can maintain that, it's probably best not to do it. And that's how I kind of came to my decision.
Wonderful. Been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We'll do this again sometime, and really nice to talk to a fellow jouster as well.